What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Chocolatito Boxing Show. And here's another episode for you guys. Let's focus on what happened this past Saturday night as Boots Ennis, once again out in Philly, headlining and putting his title on the line against a former foe of his in Jaron. Jaron Chocolatito and Ennis faced off against each other back in January of 23, and that was for the interim IBF title, the current title that Jaron Ennis holds. Boots was since elevated after his victory over Roman Villa. He was elevated to full version or full status champion of the IBF. He then defended that earlier this year in July against Avanesian. And now he put his title on the line against a former foe in Jaron Chocolatito. Now, Chocolatito and Ennis, when they faced off against each other in January of 23, that was for the interim version of the title. Chocolatito managed to stay atop the IBF rankings, putting 3 victories together for himself between Jaron Ennis fights. 2 of those 3 victories by TKO. One of those victories garnered him the intercontinental version of the IBF, which punched his ticket into a second shot at current champion Boots Ennis. And that's how this fight came to be. IBF mandated it, Jaron Ennis obliged, and again he gets his hand raised this past Saturday night as the victor and retains his IBF title. If I put it to you like that, it sounds a lot easier than it really was. This was a complicated fight and a complicated night. 24 rounds between these two fighters. A fight in which Chocolatito did a lot better than he did and fought a lot better against Ennis than he did in the first one. He's a boxer who tends to switch to counterpuncher, but mostly a boxer that likes to disrupt by way of his jab. Very good combinations, and likes to throw down center range. That was giving problems to Boots. Boots tends to loop his punches a lot more. He's a lot more elusive, moves a lot more, elusive footwork. And those looping punches that he throws from different angles, well, a lot of times he was being caught on the counterpunching. He was being caught down center as Chocolatito would not give up his standing, not give up much ground, would stand his ground and punch down center range. And it continued to catch Boots on several occasions. On several occasions, it looked like he hurt him. Mixes up his uppercuts into his attack, into his onslaught very well, Chocolatito does. And Boots, more elusive, punches from different angles, more of an entertaining type fighter, very creative. It was not paying off for him in this fight, and he did not look as great as he has in the past. He looked a lot more human. This is an opponent that obviously studied him. This is an opponent that has already shared the ring with him. When the distance with them, when they faced off against each other in January of 23, and knew very well how to approach Boots on this second go-around. He nearly pulled off the upset. Boots was hurt. Boots was shaken. His legs didn't abandon him, but he was on shaky legs, and he was definitely stumbling there on multiple occasions as Chocolatito got the best of him. There was an exchange that happened early rounds of the fight. I think it was round 5, I want to say, where they have an exchange, and Chocolatito gets the best of Boots on a couple occasions, but Boots just basically resorted to his power, hurts Chocolatito, and eventually holds him against, or not holds him, but pins him against the ropes in an offensive onslaught and manages to drop Chocolatito. And it looked like Boots was going to pick up, not let him recover. I guess pick up is not the right phrase I want to say. I want to say capitalize on that knockdown. All signs were pointing to a stoppage victory for Boots after he managed to hurt him and drop him. But he let Chookagian recover, the round came to an end, and then we ended up with a long, drawn-out exchange type fight where they were catching the best of each other and connecting on one another, but neither cementing the dominance over the other. Boots got the better of the exchanges. Boots got the higher punch output, the higher punch connectivity, and gets his hand raised in the end in what was a very complicated fight that humanized the IBF champion. And at the conclusion of the fight, Boots himself says that he didn't fight to his standards. And sometimes those comments, those acknowledgments from one fighter will be a huge detriment to them because the critiques begin. And the critiques have been ongoing now that he has no business stepping into the ring with Crawford, no business calling out for Terence Crawford, that he's not ready, that he should stay in his lane. And I'm going to counter that. We've talked about this in the podcast before, and it's come up a multitude of times. And my counter to those critiques is that it all depends on the opposition. And for certain fighters, for the majority of fighters, when they're on the up and up, they will take on any and all comers and just start routing them. But they get to a certain level in their careers, like Boots is at right now, where he is a champion. He went from interim to being elevated to the full version champion, to calling out for the big fights. He's not getting them, but he wants to stay busy. He accomplished selling out in front of his home crowd in Philly with this fight over Evanesian. So that was another tally, another check mark to his career. And now he comes back in front of his home crowd. Another great showing for him. And as a co-main event, he had Bam Rodriguez, whom we're going to talk about here shortly. So it only helped to market and make it an even bigger event and a bigger coming out party for Boots. And then the fight ends up being a subpar fight, or at least not the excitement that people showed up to see in a knockout victory of Boots, or a one-sided victory by Boots, and a great performance, a great entertaining performance. But it ended up being a good boxing match where he managed to get a good level of rounds under his belt to continue to stay busy and to move on with his hand raised, with the belt intact, with his record intact, and to move on to pursue a better fight. The fact that he looked a little more human now is going to be great for other opponents to feel like they have a chance, more of a chance against Boots, if they didn't before. When you get to a certain level where Boots is at right now, he's kind of at a crossroads because he's a champion, asking for the big fights, wanting the big paydays, wanting to be on the biggest stages, but he's not quite getting it. And the division happens to be in a transitional period right now, since Errol has abandoned it, since Crawford has abandoned it, and big names that have left. Virgil Ortiz has left. So it's in a bit of a transition. Your champions are Boots for the IBF, Stanionis for the WBA, Mario Barrios for the WBC, Brian Norman for the WBO. All fighters that were basically interim champs on standby because of the organizations wanting to maintain Crawford as a viable champion in that 147. Now Crawford has since moved on, was successful in his victory over Madrimov, and holds a version, I think that's the WBA title that he defeated Madrimov for at 154. So now these fighters begin to get elevated to full status champions, but they don't have the highest profiles. Brian Norman priced himself out with a fight over in negotiations with Boots. So that fight didn't happen. Now he seems like he's out with an injury. So his fight didn't take place. He hasn't been able to defend his title. Boots, this is the second defense of his title. Mario Barrios is about to be on the undercard of Jake Paul and Mike Tyson, defending against veteran Abel Ramos. He wanted to get into a negotiation and a fight with Manny Pacquiao. Mario Barrios did. That didn't happen. And then you got Imantas Estaniones, who is on contractual negotiations right now himself, so he could come back and be active and stay as an active champion. None of them are household names. Boots is probably the most recognizable, but still not a household name. So what I'm getting at is we've seen this before, where fighters at a certain stage in their career don't wake up, don't get up for their opponent, and end up having subpar performances. He did enough to be able to secure the victory, to retain his title, and to move on to another fight, hoping that it's a bigger fight. Oscar De La Hoya claiming that he wants to make Boots and Virgil. I don't know if Virgil would be able to come back to 147 because he's been plagued time and again with his weight cuts, dating back to when he used to campaign at 140, Virgil Ortiz. Ryan Garcia got on next, started posting and going back and forth, exchanging barbs with Boots Ennis, wanting that fight. Blair the Flair was on hand at the post-fight press conference, wanting a fight with, wanting to get himself into negotiations and a fight with Boots, and Eddie Hearn basically knocked that down. Blair the Flair coming off his victory over Adrian Broner. Other than that, relatively inactive. You guys could see an interview that I had with Blair the Flair earlier this summer where he talks about Boots, and I have it on the YouTube channel. So from there's not really big money fights for Boots. You can't blame him for not getting up for an opponent in Karen Chukadzian, who is a relatively unknown fighter. Not much is done for Boots other than stay active and retain his title. A fighter that he had already beat a year prior. There wasn't much excitement for him. So of course he's gonna have a good camp, but not the greatest of camps. There's no fire burning for him for a Karen Chukadzian versus if it was to be a Terence Crawford. So for the critiques and the critics that have come out, the critiques that are already roaming out there, and the critics saying that he's a hyped up champion, that he's not who people say that he is, and this. Think about this. Keith Thurman, who wanted to get himself into a fight with Tim Tszyu, if he was to come back, just a name like Keith Thurman, that would wake up Boots. That's a fighter that was the who's who in the welterweight division post-Mayweather era. And had some amazing fights himself. And an amazing resume, an amazing history in the welterweight division. And was migrating up. But he's been plagued with injuries and delays and what have you. But he fought Mario Barrios, beat Mario Barrios. Was going to fight Tim Tszyu at 154, make his debut at 154. Never happened. A Keith Thurman Boots Ennis would be a good passing of the torch and a fight that Boots would end up waking up for. A fight with Virgil Ortiz would be a fight that he would wake up for, knowing that Virgil Ortiz is a heavy-handed slugger. You bet that Boots will wake up in that camp. That's where I feel that these critiques are flawed. And these critics, and you see a lot of podcasts that came out already and a lot of shows on YouTube and so forth, they're already like, Boots is overhyped. Boots is not who they say he is. Boots is not ready. He's not at this level. He's not at that. He doesn't deserve a fight with Crawford. All that is BS and clout. Stop listening to that because it's happened time and again. Go back, and one fight that always comes to mind is Miguel Cotto against Saddam Ali, where his bicep ends up busting. This was a subpar Cotto he had no interest, just like with Delvin Rodriguez. He had no interest in these fights anymore, but he was just doing it for the sake of staying active, for the sake of just fighting. He was the champ at that time, trying to defend his title. Those are fights that they're not going to wake up for. A Yuri Foreman, Miguel Cotto at that time, well, that's who he needed to fight. Miguel Cotto would show up as a true professional and fight, but you would see the performance versus when he fought Canelo. What an amazing fight versus a Cotto that fought Shane Mosley. They wake up for certain fighters because there's a name, there's a trajectory, there's a resume, there's a fan base, there's marketability, there's money that comes behind certain fighters and certain opponents. What did Karen Chukatsian bring to the table? So you can't blame Boots for the type of performance that he had, but he managed to edge it out. He managed to do enough to secure his victory, to get the decision victory, get the decision from the judges, and retain his title and move on to another performance. He doesn't need to apologize to anybody. Now, if he gets into a fight with a higher level name or a more recognizable name, I got an interview with Alexis Rocha a week ago. Check that interview out on the YouTube channel. Alexis Rocha is stacking up small version titles so he could actually get himself into title contention and have a big... His career was derailed with Giovanni Santillan recently, where he got stopped. Then Giovanni Santillan goes on to fight Brian Norman for the title, for the vacant title, and Brian Norman just bloodied and stopped and came out with that amazing performance, but we haven't seen him since. That was in May. So Brian Norman's pretty much out for the rest of the calendar year, having secured an interim version to the title, now elevated to full version, and he can't defend it. And he outpriced himself in negotiations with Boots. So Alexis Rocha is going to line himself up there. That's a fight and a somewhat recognizable name that Boots would probably wake up for. What about Mario Barrios? Should he be successful over Abel Ramos, a veteran in Ramos, who I bet is probably going to be a lot of trouble for Mario Barrios? If Barrios is successful, Barrios and Ennis would probably be the most marketable fight to make at 147 and a fun, fan-friendly style fight. What about Stanionis and Boots? That's a fight that was talked about before. That's a big unification bout. Stanionis looking to stay active and get a fight in before the calendar year is over. I believe he's got contract negotiations or bidding sometime that expires next week. So don't be so quick to just start bursting the balloon of Boots Ennis and saying that he's not this, he's not that. Just look at the level of opposition that he had, and can you blame him? I can't. Let's see how he performs against another big name before everybody starts calling him a flaw or a fake or a fraud. Because Boots is legit. He's got a lot of talent. He's legit. And I'm a big fan of his style. And this happens. And it's happened to every big name fighter that you could think of. They just don't wake up for certain level of opposition. It's hard. But there's fighters that will wake them up and there's fighters that don't. So they'll have subpar camps and somewhat distracted. It's not the same when they reach a certain level in their career versus when they're climbing up the ranks. The fire starts dimming out a little bit. We look at the rest of the card, and we just mentioned earlier the co-main event was none other than Jesse Bam Rodriguez, and he puts on a performance of a lifetime and stole the night, in my opinion. There was several good fights in the card. Bam Rodriguez is the one that legitimized the ticket sales and the ticket prices and the butts and seats. People came to see Boots, but Jesse is the one that legitimized the card. 21-0, comes out with another knockout victory stoppage win over veteran Pedro Guevara. handing him the 5th loss of his career, and Jesse Rodriguez looking to either unify with Pumita Martinez, who's going to be fighting Ioka, I believe, at the close of the calendar year. He expressed that he wants to unify the entire division. But there's also been talks that Bam would be interested in fighting Junto Nakatani at 118. That rematch with Gallo Estrada is no longer in talks. Gallo Estrada came out last week and announced that he's going to migrate to 118, going to bantamweight, and that's going to be his last hurrah to try to gain a title there in his last stretch of his career, instead of pursuing a rematch with Bam. And the legend killer in Jesse Bam Rodriguez, there's one person that remains that he didn't get to beat or he hasn't been able to fight, but shared a multitude of rounds against in sparring in preparation for his last showdown against Gallo Estrada. And that was Chocolatito. Two friends who sparred against one another. Chocolatito helped Jesse prepare for Gallo Estrada. And they vowed that they would not fight against one another. And then the talk started changing that if the price was right, if the money was right, they would do it. For legacy, for this, for that. Well, remember, Jesse was called the legend killer because of what he started, or his ascension into the sport. He was called as a last-minute replacement when Príncipe Carlos Cuadras was set to face Gallo Estrada. Gallo Estrada ends up falling ill with COVID. This is a couple years back. Enter Bam Rodriguez, who migrated from 112, lesser known Jesse Rodriguez, younger brother of Joshua Franco, who is now retired, at the hands of Ioka, who we just mentioned, as a matter of fact. He beats Carlos Cuadras. And remember, the reason he's called the legend killer is because they were deeming that there were 4 fighters that were resembling the 4 kings of the 80s era. Hagler, Leonard, Hearns, Duran. The 4 princes of boxing in today's era was Chocolatito, Gallo Estrada, Carlos Cuadras, Sor Rungvisai, who had done the round robin and faced off against one another and lifted titles from each other, avenged losses against one another, and had all fought in a round robin setting, unlike we've seen in any other division. What people asked for, these guys were delivering at 115 pounds. So when Jesse entered as a stand-in for Gallo Estrada to fight Cuadras, well, Cuadras was a favorite to win against a lesser-known fighter, and Jesse ended up dropping Cuadras and pulls off the decision win, lifting the interim version of that title against Cuadras, beating him. He moves on 2-3 months later and drops and stops Rungvisai, and now had 2 of the 4 legends under his belt. He recently beat Gallo Estrada in his very last outing, lifting the title from him and securing his old interim title back, the WBC title at 115. Now he's got 3 of the legends, 3 of the Príncipes of 115 under his belt, and the remaining man is Chocolatito, a former sparring partner of his. And now it's either going to be a Chocolatito legacy fight, the legend killer getting to secure the circle, or close the circle, close that phase of his career by conquering all 4 legends, or he will go against Pumita Martinez and try to unify the division. He's in an interesting spot, and he is performing at the highest level possible right now. Bam is firing on all cylinders, and he looked even better than he did just a few months ago against Juan Francisco Estrada. That uppercut that he finished Guevara he's just on a demolition path. He's wrecking through his opponents. He's overpowering them. He looks so unassuming with an oversized hat and his oversized sweaters and his oversized clothing, and he looks so unassuming, so innocent, and he is an absolute monster in that ring. You got Cafu, who just became the recent champion for the WBO. He just ended up pulling off a shocker, and he ends up winning the title for the WBO. And let me bring up everybody else, see if anybody else is scheduled here, because I believe there's negotiations between Martinez. So Kenshiro Teraji being the WBA champ. And then Fumela Cafu ended up, let me see, I think I got the wrong, because Teraji is the champ at 112. Let's bring up the correct. We're one division south. There we go. So Fernando Martinez, he was the unified champ, but I believe the IBF, they're trying to lift that title. The IBF is gonna strip that title from Martinez. And Katsuto Ioka should be the WBA champ. Ioka being the man that ultimately dethroned and retired Joshua Franco, Bam's brother. Let me bring up a different site to see the actual champion. So I was just on BoxRec, and BoxRec no longer lists any WBA champions. So let's see if we could find the current list. So yeah, Fernando Martinez has been stripped by the IBF. He was the sole unified champion at super flyweight at 115. He has now been stripped from the IBF. That title is vacant for failing to defend it. He's in negotiations to fight Katsuto Ioka. Katsuto Ioka, as you know, he usually does those big Christmas or New Year's Eve events to close out each calendar year. And it looks like Fernando Martinez is headed to fight Katsuto Ioka at the close of the year. He's the WBA champ at the moment. Jesse Rodriguez, your WBC champ, who just successfully defended the title, lifting it. He was the original interim, lifted the title from Gallo Estrada, the full version, and now successfully defended it. There's a vacant IBF that Jesse Rodriguez could fight for. And then you got Fumela Cafu, who recently became a champion for the WBO. And let me see who's in line for that IBF title. Let's see if we could jump around in sites here. World Champions. Here's another site that I've used from time to time. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. Box.live. So there we go. Jesse Rodriguez, Fumela Cafu, vacant IBF. Pedro Guevara had the interim version, so that's how he ended up coming into that mandatory shot. Jesse. Yeah, very, very interesting if Fernando Martinez, who keeps calling out Jesse Rodriguez, very interesting if that fight's going to happen. Let me see if that fight is happening. The rematch between Martinez and Chocolatito-Ioka. Yep, they're scheduled for New Year's Eve. They're scheduled for New Year's Eve, so that's when they each put their titles, the WBA, IBF. So Martinez had the IBF title with them, ends up lifting the WBA title by defeating Chocolatito-Ioka, and now they're gonna have their rematch on New Year's Eve. And Kosei Tanaka lost to Fumele Kafu, so that IBF title is going to be interesting to see who fights for it, who competes for it. Maybe Chocolatito could actually end up fighting for that vacant IBF if the IBF sanctions it. And then you would have a big unification, legendary type fight, legacy fight against Jesse Rodriguez. And that would even be a bigger payday for not just both, but it would be a more meaningful fight. So that's the story of the co-main event there. The other fights that I wanted to point out to you that took place on this card to close out the episode of Boots where Austin Williams, Ammo Williams, returned from his sole loss of his career, which was at the hands of Hamza Shiraz. That was during the 5v5 Queensberry and Matchroom. And he got knocked out at the hands of Hamza Shiraz. I think it was like round 11 or so when it happened. I'm going to revisit that real quick. Let me get back to that card. Because Emma Williams looked really good. And he's back. I got to talk to him briefly when I went to do the coverage for Pacheco Sulecki. Really nice guy. And he was talking to me about mental health and everything that he had to endure and overcome after that loss at the hands of Hamza Shiraz. He's now 17-1, gets another knockout to his credit, and defeated Guillen Garrido, who's also an up-and-coming fighter himself, handing Garrido the second loss of his career and drops to 11-2 record. So he stops him in the 5th round. And then somebody else who bounced back after losing his title at the hands of Nick Ball was Ray Ford. And Ray Ford put on an amazing performance. It ends up going to a unanimous decision win, even though it looked like he was en route to stopping Orlando Gonzalez. The veteran Gonzalez, this was the 25th fight or 26th fight of his career, picks up the 3rd loss and got dropped and hurt by Ray Ford throughout the fight. Ray Ford improves to 16-1-1, now campaigning at 130 pounds after having lost his title to Nick Ball, and now is going to be a who's who type challenger for any of the main champions at 130 pounds. At 130, you have Ushaki Foster, who regained his title by defeating, in the rematch fight, by defeating Conceição. You have Lamont Roach, who's a WBA champ. He looks like he's going to be challenging one division north, challenging Gervonta Davis for his 135-pound strap for the same organization, WBA. You got Oscar Valdez, who holds the interim to Emmanuel Navarrete's WBO full version title. They're set to rematch in December 14th or December 7th out in Arizona. And then it leaves Anthony Casachi, who's the IBF champ, and it looks like he might be in negotiations with Sugar Nunez should that fight happen. Ray Ford, a very viable and live contender in that division for any of those champions, and he's looking that way. He performed great. He no longer has to deal with weight cut issues that he complained about in his lead up with Nick Ball. And then in the prior fight to Nick Ball, he had complained about his legs cramping on him mid-fight and experiencing numerous obstacles because of the weight cuts. He ends up dropping a close decision to Nick Ball, loses his title, and decides to, rather than pursue the rematch, to just move north and campaign at 130 pounds. He looks amazing in his return and in his arrival to this new division. So congrats to Ray Ford. Congrats to Ammo Williams, who's back on the win column. And Bam Rodriguez, who's cementing himself as the legit super flyweight And we'll see what happens, whether he fights Chocolatito, whether he decides to move up and challenge Junto at 118, or what happens with Bam. But we got to keep a close eye on Bam because the legend killer is on an absolute tear at the moment and performing at his absolute best right now. He's at the best moment of his career, and that's a good combination between him and Boots because it looks like they'll be like co-features, reviving the co-feature approach that we would see in the past between Triple G and Chocolatito themselves. So that was pretty cool. And then Boots, listen, he retains his title, not the most exciting fashion, but he lives on to fight for a bigger payday, to move on to bigger and better things. And again, don't be so quick to rain on his parade. Don't be so quick to discard him. It's hard to wake up for opponents that don't really offer you much or offer your career much. He retains his title, remains undefeated, has an absolute amazing record, and has a big crowd that supports him now out of Philly. We know we could sell out arenas. We know that he could pack an arena, that he brings a huge fan base with him now. It's a matter of pairing him up with somebody that provides the same in return, and then we'll see the very best of Boots Ennis come out once again. He was an absolute tear trying to get to the title, and now he's fighting lesser known names, and that's what's hard for him to stay up for. He's going to get a big opponent, and that's when we'll be able to gauge what level Boots Ennis is really at when he fights a Mario Barrios for a unification, a Staniones, or maybe a legacy type fight against another name. Maybe Virgil Ortiz comes down. We'll see. But maybe he answers the call of Teofimo and gives him the shot. Teofimo wanting to challenge Crawford at welterweight. Crawford's already campaigning at 154. Maybe he opens the door for a Ryan Garcia or a Teofimo and says, let's go. And that's a big money fight, and it'll be a good gauge to see where Boots Ennis is at in his career, at this stage of his career and in his stardom. So congrats to Boots, congrats to Bam, and the other aforementioned fighters. Thank you guys again for tuning in to another episode of the Chocolatito Boxing Show, for the continued support, and I'll catch you all on the next episode. Take care.